America. I'm the chair of Stratford for Europe, and it gives me great pleasure to start off tonight's proceedings. I'd just like to say a very special welcome to all of you, but especially to the younger members of the audience. We're delighted to have some young people in the audience, and also some very young teachers. So welcome to you. Tonight's talk, as we said, is very much about the sort of future that young people will have, so we're delighted to see a real mix of ages. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to our guest, but just want to point out that after his talk, there will be an opportunity for questions, but we ask you politely, please, to keep it to questions and not to statements or speeches. We don't get many complaints at Stratford for Europe, but the only complaint we do get is about the people who ask questions turning it into speeches and statements. I'm sure you all agree. So could we please have just very short, one sentence, quick questions. It also helps Michael because Michael's memory can't remember a long speech. Well, he probably can. It's me that can't remember long speeches, if I'm honest. And also afterwards, after the talk, after the questions, there will be some refreshments outside. So do please stay and have a cup of coffee, and I'm sure Michael, if his voice holds out, because he's got a bit of a cold, will stop behind to chat informally with you. Now, for those of you who've been to one of Michael's talks before, or who have seen his YouTube presentations, you will need no introduction to him. But for those of you who haven't, then let me just quickly say that Michael is Professor of European Law and the Jean Monnet Chair in European Union Law at the University of Liverpool. He specialises in EU law, particularly EU constitutional law, the single market and EU welfare law. And as well as publishing widely, he has also advised various government departments and committees on European affairs. Now, Michael's probably totally fed up with being acclaimed as the internet star of the June 2016 referendum when his lecture on the industrial scale dishonesty of the Leave campaign attracted over 7 million hits on Facebook and YouTube. Especially as since then he's been on the campaign trail, he's been attracting much more recent notice for his in-depth commentary on the current post-referendum situation from his perspective as a leading EU lawyer. And now that we've reached such a critical point in the unfolding Brexit saga, we're delighted that Michael is here again tonight to shed some light on what price a Brexit deal. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm Stratford welcome to Professor Michael Dougan.
Thanks very much to Stratford for Europe for the invitation to come back to Stratford. It's a lovely town, and I'm really happy to have any opportunity to come back. I'm going to spend a little bit of tomorrow here as well. Thank you very much to Jonathan for the very warm welcome, and also to the audience. The idea is, and I do apologise if I have to cough and sniffle a little bit, and I do apologise especially if there's any projectile phlegm. It happened in a meeting at work earlier today, and I'm very conscious of it, and I will try not to. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes maximum, and then that should be plenty of time for questions afterwards. And the theme of my talk is a pretty detailed analysis of the proposed withdrawal package that was agreed by the UK government and the European Commission last week, and then endorsed by the leaders of the EU27 at an extraordinary meeting of the European Council on Sunday just past. Now, the package itself, I'm sure you know, but I'll do it systematically, consists of two main things. And the first is the text for a withdrawal agreement. And that withdrawal agreement has a relatively limited purpose. It's basically designed to ensure that the immediate challenges of the UK simply leaving the EU, just the very act of leaving the EU, happens in a smooth and orderly rather than a chaotic and disorderly way. It's a pretty hefty text, as I'm sure you're told, although to be frank, for a lawyer, 600 pages is a sort of light read rather than hefty. But I can understand from a journalist's point of view that it seems very big. Actually, the whole thing is in this folder. It's not that huge, but this is printed about 6 pages to a page. And no wonder my eyes aren't great anymore. And it will be a legally binding international treaty. The second document is a political declaration, and that political declaration is simply meant to list the principles that will govern future negotiations on what the relationship between the EU and the UK might look like in decades to come, covering issues such as trade, security, the environment, research, culture, so on and so forth. In itself, it's a relatively short document, depending on the format that you print it out on. It will be between 25 and 30 pages. But most importantly, it's merely an aspirational statement of intent. It has no legal value, no legal status. It doesn't promise anything which it's guaranteed to be delivered at all, or with any particular timescale, or with any particular content. To give you an idea of what that transition job is about, we'd normally expect a future relationship agreement of the type which will need to be negotiated between the EU and the UK to be somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 pages. That's more like the type of text that we enjoy reading as lawyers. But that's what they've got to do. They've got to translate the 25, 30 pages into 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 pages. Now that entire package, the legally binding withdrawal agreement on the orderly departure, the political declaration on the framework for negotiations on the future, now has to be formally approved by the UK Parliament, by the EU 27 governments acting within the Council, and of course by the European Parliament. And if all three of those approvals are granted, and obviously the most problematic is the UK one, then the withdrawal package can be ratified and the necessary steps can be taken to ensure its implementation in time for the 29th of March 2019. So that's basically the package that we're talking about, treaty plus declaration. So let's now launch into our more detailed analysis of the content of the withdrawal package, and we'll start off with the withdrawal treaty, the big treaty. Now, it has to be said that very large parts of this text are so boring that even I find it tough going just to keep my eyes open, working my way through it. For example, Part 3 of the treaty deals with a very large number of very specialist, very technical, really tedious lists of cross-references to regulations and directives, which are basically just about winding down the UK's engagement with EU rules or institutions on the 29th of March 2019 or at the end of the transitional period. What do you do with all of those court proceedings which are still ongoing at that date? What do you do with requests by police forces for cooperation and data sharing which haven't been answered at that date? What do you do with the intellectual property rights that people already have protected at that date? It's very technical, it's of very little interest to people other than the ones who are actually going to be directly affected by it at that time. Or again, take Part 5 of the treaty, which is about the UK's financial settlement, the so-called divorce bill. Now, of course, here we know that the Brexiteers believe that this is the price that the UK has to pay in order to secure a good future deal on trade, whereas everyone else in the world says, no, this is just you paying your bill for your past liabilities and commitments that you entered into as a member state, and now you've got to pay the bill because this is what you have to do in the real world. Now, whatever the gap in political perception, and however much that has caused controversy within UK politics, the actual treaty provisions are, I mean, as we say in Liverpool, they are so boring they would send a glass eye to sleep. And it's no exaggeration to say that they, even by the standards of what I am used to, they are utterly tedious. But of course, the draft treaty also deals with a set of much more fundamental issues, and these are genuinely important. They're not merely technical, they're not merely specialist interests, these are of fundamental importance. And I'll deal with all three of them tonight. First of all, the protection of existing migrant citizens who've already made use of their right to free movement, either to live in the UK or as UK citizens to live elsewhere in Europe. Secondly, the transitional period, which is intended to protect all of us, every single person in this room and indeed in this country, from the otherwise what would be disastrous effects of withdrawal. And thirdly, there's the backstop arrangement, which is meant to provide a solution to the return of a hard border and potentially the collapse of the peace process in Northern Ireland by making really quite far-reaching commitments for the UK as a whole. So citizens' rights, transition, and then backstop. Citizens' rights, first of all. Now here, it's important to just be clear about what we're actually talking about. We're talking about the future protection of citizens, either British citizens or EU27 citizens, who've already exercised their right to free movement, whether to work or to study or to retire, by the cut-off date, and they need to be protected under the proposed treaty. What we're not talking about is the future UK or EU immigration status of everybody else into the future. If in 5 years' time and withdrawal has happened as planned, one of us decides that we want to go off and retire to France, we're not talking about that situation. That is still to be determined. Suffice to say that Theresa May, of course, we know, is fond of boasting about how free movement is about to come to an end once and for all. This is her new tedious catchphrase. And it's fair to say on her that it's one of the few significant things that she can claim as an achievement, in inverted commas, in the negotiations. But of course, by achievement, what we don't mean is some sort of genuine positive contribution to the life of this country. What we mean, of course, is a victory for propaganda and bigotry over evidence and rational self-interest. So an achievement... It is an achievement of sorts. It is one of the greatest triumphs yet, though far from the last, for post-truth politics in Brexit Britain. But even focusing on the legal regime that will govern the future protection of existing migrant citizens, I'm going to have to be still quite specific, because I'm going to talk only really about the provisions of this treaty, not the 28 national implementation systems for that treaty that then need to be carried out right across Europe and here in the UK. Now, that national implementation is actually very important. It's true that most of the citizens' rights provisions in this text are very detailed, they're very precise, they're intended to be directly enforceable by individuals in the event of a dispute before a national court. But on the other hand, some of the provisions do allow individual countries to make important discretionary choices about precisely how they are going to treat existing migrant citizens. So those provisions of that treaty need to be read within the particular national context of each individual country that we're talking about. Moreover, and probably just as importantly, the treaty regime is explicitly described as a minimum standard only. There's nothing to stop individual countries offering more generous levels of protection, whether to wider categories of individuals than those who are entitled to protection under the treaty, or better content of rights compared to what the treaty itself would offer. The problem is, of course, that we don't just lack the time, but I lack the expertise to talk about 27 different immigration systems and how they're going to implement these provisions, so we'll just focus on the basic text in the treaty. Now, the idea itself is pretty straightforward, and this is the situation where in a law lecture I'd read out a sentence and all of the law students would immediately breaking it up into the sub-clauses and then start to assign a page for each sub-clause because they know that each word is about to get a definition and a sub-definition and a sub-sub-definition and all the rest of it. EU and UK nationals who are already lawfully resident in their host country under EU law at the relevant cut-off date will be offered a new system to protect their subsequent residency and associated rights. And that's basically the deal. If you're already lawfully resident in another country under EU law at the relevant cut-off date, you'll be offered a new system to protect your future residency and associated rights. Now, if you've already built up 5 years of residency, then you'll qualify for long-term protection. So 5 years residency, long-term protection. If you haven't already built up 5 years of protection or of residency, you're offered interim or temporary protection, and then you have to carry on complying with the EU rules until you get to the 5-year mark. Now, that's the basic idea, and the idea itself, I suppose, isn't too complicated, but let's break it down into some of its key elements, because there are obviously problems on every front. Now, the first question is, what's the relevant cut-off date? What is the actual date which these provisions will kick in? Obviously, that date is crucial. Anybody who's moved before the cut-off date will do so under existing EU free movement rules, and they will be potentially entitled to protection into the future for their acquired rights. By contrast, almost everybody who moves after the cut-off date will be doing so subject to ordinary national immigration rules at the treatment of whatever that country, the UK or otherwise, has to say about you. Now, the relevant cut-off date, at the EU's insistence, is not the date of actual withdrawal. It's not March 2019. It will be the end of the transitional period. And that's going to be the relevant cut-off date will be the end of the transitional period. In principle, that means the end of December 2020, but of course, as we'll talk about in a bit more detail, now that Theresa May has asked for to extend the transitional period, it might well be that free movement rules, and with them the cut-off date for future protection, will be an extra 3 or even 4 years. So that gives everybody at least another couple of years to build up their 5 years to gain secure residence, or it gives the rest of us an extra few years to decide that we're just going to move country altogether and begin to acquire a protected status under this treaty. Now, the second element under this regime is that it relies on existing EU law as the basis for protection. So it's free movement law under EU rules that actually defines who is going to be protected and what rights they get. And as such, that means that this treaty incorporates all of the familiar problems with EU free movement law as well as its benefits. Now here we just simply have to wipe our minds clean of the incessant Leave and indeed government propaganda about unlimited free movement rights, unlimited free movement rights. There's no such thing. There's no such thing. Free movement before you become a long-term permanent resident basically means you're either economically active, you're in a job, you're paying taxes, or you're running a business and paying taxes, or you're financially independent. You're wealthy enough to look after yourself without claiming public benefits, and you have comprehensive sickness insurance in your host country. Now, there are a few exceptions to those two main categories, the economically active, the financially independent. For example, if somebody is working and has a serious accident at work that renders them incapable of working anymore, they are given accelerated rights. It doesn't seem that inhumane to me. But by and large, that's the rules. And to put it quite simply, there is no such thing as the right to just up and go and live in another country and live off its public benefits. It just doesn't exist as a matter of EU law. Now, to qualify for protection under this withdrawal agreement, you must comply with those criteria. You must have lived in your host country for the 5-year period, either as an economically active person or as a financially independent person. And that's where the potential problems begin to kick in, because what happens to those people whose residency throughout that 5-year period was not fully compliant with those EU rules? For example, as my very good friend and colleague in York, Charlotte O'Brien, has pointed out, these rules create serious problems for women who've taken a career break to raise children. They raise serious problems for people who've taken time off work to care for a sick relative and so on. These have very serious implications for people who actually cannot prove continuous sickness insurance throughout the whole time that they've lived in a territory. But probably the main problem is that many member states, the UK included, in fact the UK probably most of all, have never really enforced the EU free movement rules, ever. They don't insist upon people meeting the criteria, they don't deal with people in the situations of non-compliance, and that basically means that there are potentially tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people across Europe who believe that they are lawfully resident because nobody's tried to kick them out, but they're not actually lawfully resident because they don't meet the requirements of economic activity or financial independence. Now, this is going to come as a nasty surprise in those countries which do decide we're going to start enforcing the rules properly. When a UK national applies to a country and says, I want to be able to stay here, I've been here for 15, 20 years, and then they're asked, well, where's your comprehensive sickness insurance? You don't have it, or at least you can't prove it for the last 5 years. Cheerio. Nevertheless, as we said before, this is a minimum standard only, and countries can decide to continue not to enforce the rules into the future. And that's basically what the UK government has said. The UK government has said that it will operate a more straightforward system for EU nationals living in the UK at the end of the transition, based primarily on evidence of residence and without necessarily insisting on evidence of, for example, continuous sickness insurance. The third main element of the regime concerns those situations where actually, although there's an EU law baseline, In many respects, this agreement falls below that EU law baseline. The government always likes to say EU nationals in the UK can continue with their lives almost just as before. Almost just as before. Now, there are a whole range of situations where actually this treaty deviates downwards from the just as before promise that was made by the government. For example, the treaty says that all member states are entitled to insist that a migrant citizen has to go through a proactive process of registration in order to benefit from protection. And if you don't proactively register yourself and fulfill all of the requirements, you lose your rights. Or again, the range of family members who would be entitled to join a protected citizen in the host state after the transitional period is significantly more limited in terms of the range of people who you can fall in love with than would be the case under ordinary EU law. Moreover, there are several situations where the loss of existing EU rights just isn't dealt with in this proposed treaty at all, and this by and large impacts upon British nationals. There's no provision for continued rights to vote in local elections. Basically, all 5 to 6 million people, where the calculations differ, are effectively disenfranchised unless the territory that they live in decides voluntarily to give them back their voting rights. But probably the most striking feature is that there's no provision for onward movement rights of UK nationals living across the EU 27. And this is the problem of the so-called golden cage. You're protected in France, but you've no right to leave France and go to Germany. You've no right to stay in France and do a job in Spain. You're protected in France, and that's it. Now, the UK says that this will be addressed within the negotiations on the future relationship. In the meantime, it is important to point out that existing EU rules on the internal migration of third country nationals, for that is what we will henceforth be, the existing rules on the internal circulation of third country nationals do provide for certain rights and benefits for what will be UK citizens into the future. So there are restrictions, there are limitations, some of them are minor, some of them are extremely significant, but there is also a much broader point to bear in mind here. Because the entire basis and context and nature of movement between the UK and the EU is about to change, and change utterly, profoundly. For everyone, of course, but even for the people who are supposedly protected under this treaty. Things that weren't really a problem before are going to become potentially serious problems in the future, especially because under EU citizenship, if you have a problem, if you change your status, if you do something naughty, if there's an issue, it's only ever temporary, it can always be rectified, things can always be put right. Under this treaty, if something goes wrong, if you lose your rights, if you change status and thereby imperil your protection, that's it. It's gone, and it's gone forever, and you will never get it back. The fourth and final key element of the new regime concerns its interpretation and enforcement, particularly on the ground within the UK and across the EU 27. Now here, the proposed treaty sets out a pretty comprehensive regime. There are lots of rules about consistent interpretation between the UK and the EU for citizens' rights. There are rules about legal enforcement by citizens of their rights before the national courts. There's some extra provisions on monitoring and compliance, including a new independent authority within the UK. But in fact, whereas most lawyers look at this part of the deal and say, yeah, it looks all right, it seems to do the job, most of the problems here have been raised in an empirical and practical sense. And again, we'll just take the UK as an example. The UK Home Office can barely cope with the number of people who have to be processed for passport and immigration purposes at the moment. The idea that they are going to deal with an extra 3 million people under a completely novel regime is a guarantee that things are going to go wrong. Things are going to go wrong. It's not a question of if, it's a question of just how bad it will be. There will be large numbers of people who have simply, in the UK, little or no engagement with the national immigration authorities because they've never bloody had to. And they might not even be aware that they need to go through this system. They might not even be aware that they're going to be affected by it. Will the government's publicity be adequate? I still regularly meet my fellow EU citizens who've never even heard of this settled status scheme. What will the authorities do if significant numbers of people just don't engage? What happens if 300,000 EU nationals just don't register? Are we going to deport them all? Are we going to just kick them all out? These are very difficult and very important questions. Another group of issues relates not to potential abuses of power by public authorities, but rather to the intersection between the citizens' rights regime in this treaty and private sector behaviour. What will be the impact of all of this uncertainty, of this new legal regime, upon the treatment of EU citizens in the UK or UK citizens across the rest of Europe by private employers, by private landlords, by private businesses such as banks and so on? And in the UK, at least, these concerns are seriously exacerbated by the government's weird decision not to actually issue a physical document to prove your status. You'll be given a reference number, and you're expected to just hand your personal reference number over to a potential landlord, or bank, or business, and let them verify it online. Sounds foolproof, doesn't it? Sounds completely foolproof. Let's wrap up on citizens' rights. Now, we could say that this part of the deal is basically all right. It's satisfactory. We can hope that individual countries are going to err on the side of generosity when it comes to their national implementation and enforcement. We can keep our fingers crossed that most people have a relatively smooth and trouble-free experience of shifting from their current status to their new status. We can cynically assume that the people who are going to be really adversely affected should be relatively small in number, and they made their own lives complicated anyway. I mean, we can say all of this rubbish if it makes ourselves feel better. But the real question is this good enough for a civilized country? And the answer is no. Even if Brexit gave no other cause for concern, even if there were nothing else to complain about, the very fact that millions upon millions of people here and across the rest of Europe have seen their lives and their futures thrown into a state of complete uncertainty and anxiety is a shameful and unforgivable act of cruelty by the Leave campaign and the government. And it's not just the uncertainty and the anxiety. Let's not forget the bigger picture here. For years, EU nationals and their family members have had to listen to themselves be demonised and scapegoated by the Leave campaign in terms which are entirely dishonest and often overtly bigoted. Since the referendum, this type of completely dishonest, anti-European, anti-immigrant rhetoric has been directly endorsed and adopted by the UK government as official UK state policy. Though, as it turned out, of course, this is merely a continuation of the hostile environment towards migrants as a whole that is exemplified by the Windrush scandal and has been presided over by Teresa May. And I can't resist saying it because it's something which should not just be lost in the historical record. This is Teresa May, whose Home Office was directly accused of doctoring the evidence against EU nationals during the coalition government's balance of competence review into the relationship between the UK and the EU. The Home Office was actually publicly called out for deliberately doctoring the evidence in a major government report so as to make EU nationals look as bad as they possibly could. It is utterly shameful. So should anyone be surprised that this venom, this official animosity, sits alongside a reported rise in hate crimes and discrimination against EU nationals? Should anyone be surprised that growing numbers of those generally better educated, tax-paying, hard-working EU nationals are now shunning the UK with potentially damaging implications for our private sector and also for our public services? Of course we shouldn't be. The only surprising thing is that not a single one of these Leave campaigners hangs their head in abject shame. Let's move on then to our second main issue under the proposed withdrawal treaty, and that's transition. Now here, every informed observer knows that the UK remains ill-prepared for the full consequences of leaving simple tout court on the 29th of March 2019. That's true of public sector and also private sector preparations. It's true not only of our necessary regulatory frameworks, many of them still simply don't exist, not even as a draft, let alone as a proper final version. And let's not even get started on the dozens of public institutions that are needed to replace the EU ones that we're all doing a perfectly good job, but now we just need to replicate them by creating new ones of our own. Most of those haven't yet been created. It's not just about the regulations, the institutions, the logistical preparations, the infrastructural changes, sorting out our constitutional relationships within the UK. There is still a major confrontation between London and Edinburgh, and also bubbling away with Wales. Let's not even mention Northern Ireland. And of course, there's regularising and rebuilding international relations with 100+ countries, as well as all of the attendant international organisations right across the world. Let's just give ourselves a quick reminder. Liam Fox promised us in September 2016 that within a period of 2 years max, he'd have completed a full round of global trade deals. A full round of global trade deals. Current tally, 0. Now, in order to protect us all, and I do mean protect us all from the potentially terrible failure of responsible public administration that a no-deal Brexit would mean. And there's no other way to put it. When I was watching Newsnight last night and I saw one of those awful ERG people go on about no one has anything to fear from a no-deal Brexit. These people live on another planet. To protect us all from the potentially terrible failure of responsible public administration that a no-deal Brexit would represent, the government requested, and the withdrawal treaty provides for, a transitional period. So, although the UK is due to leave the EU on the 29th of March 2019, not much is actually going to change on the ground, at least until December 2020, possibly for another year, maybe another 2 years after that, because the UK is going to remain subject to almost all of exactly the same rules and procedures and regulations and institutions as if it were still a member state. Now, the provisions on transition were actually almost entirely agreed back in March 2018, so I always do love it when it seems to come as a shock to certain MPs to read about them. The idea is pretty straightforward. It's basically a status quo, a continuation of the status quo, with the main difference being that the UK, although it will be bound by all EU legislation, all EU executive acts, all EU case law, both old and new, we will have no representation whatsoever in any of the European institutions. There will be no seat at the European Council, no vote in the Council of Ministers, the first of the legislative bodies, no MEPs in the European Parliament, the other half of the EU legislature, no commissioner, no judges in the European court system. So when Jacob Rees-Mogg described the transition period as a condition of vassalage, he's right. Probably these people, remember, are capable of being right when it suits them. And on this issue, he's right. It is a condition of vassalage. Of course, what he doesn't then immediately admit is that the real responsibility for this condition of vassalage, which is a direct result of our own incompetent preparations, weakness and desperation, is him and his fellow Leave campaigners. But we shouldn't smirk too much, and I must admit, I do enjoy the odd smirk at the Brexit Brigade's expense, but we shouldn't smirk too much. Because the UK government didn't just request this transitional period to protect us all from a cliff edge catastrophe in a couple of months' time. There were other ways that we could have been protected from this type of cliff edge catastrophe. Much more straightforward ways, actually, much more legally simple ways, much more politically simple ways, and yet they went for this really quite complicated and controversial transitional period. Why? And the answer is, they'll manage to make sure that we leave the EU next year, but thanks to the status quo transition, most people will notice no difference for at least 2 years, maybe 3, maybe 4. And it's only after that that the full consequences of leaving the EU will actually become apparent on the ground in this country. And by that stage, it's too late for anyone to do anything about it. So let's be clear, the government was desperate to get this transition period, not just to protect us all from the consequences of its own incompetence, but also because this is part of their overall plan to deliver Brexit at any cost, while at the same time shielding themselves from accountability and legitimacy and transparency for the actual consequences of their Brexit at any cost. Returning to the withdrawal treaty, the only significant new amendment to the terms that were agreed back in March is Theresa May's request for a part of extend the transitional period. Now, we all know that she lied through her teeth about this and said that the request for an extension emerged from the primordial soup and sort of spontaneously generated itself out of atoms. Of course, the UK requested this extension. And in itself, it's an implicit admission that even the extra 20 months that were originally envisaged under transition simply aren't enough time for the UK to make the full preparations required to protect us from the immediate consequences of Brexit. But this power of extension has been very carefully delimited. It can be used once, not twice, not 3 times, just once. That was a bit biblical, wasn't it? It can only be for a fixed period of additional time, either 1 year or 2 years. The extension requires the EU's positive consent. The UK can ask for it, but the EU has to agree to it. And we can see, by the way, from Sunday's European Council that the other member states are already lining up to set out what their demands are, even for an extension of the transition, which is still over 2 years away. Chief among them being, if the UK behaves like a good little child and does what it's told and takes its medicine, we might extend the transition. UK is naughty, we might not. Let's find out. If an extension is eventually agreed upon, the UK will still be required to make an appropriate contribution to the EU budget, of course, but UK participation in research and education programmes, bless you, and so on, will be on the terms offered to third countries. We won't be treated like a member state for those purposes. Otherwise, however, the UK will remain bound by its vassalage state for a period of up to 4 years. Now, the third and final main issue in the withdrawal treaty is the backstop to prevent a hard border in Ireland. Now, the challenges created by Brexit for Northern Ireland are dealt with in a lengthy protocol to the draft treaty. I have to say I nearly gave up the ghost reading this protocol. Even compared to the stuff I've mentioned already, this was dull to a new level of non-existence. As we know, chief among the challenges, the main cause for controversy, both during the negotiations and now with the final treaty, is the so-called backstop guarantee that is meant to prevent a return of a hard border for the physical movement of goods across the island of Ireland that would otherwise be an inevitable and necessary consequence of the UK's decision to leave the single market and the customs union. Now, both the UK and the EU hope very optimistically that the need for a hard border can be avoided simply through the future relationship agreement which they're going to pursue in the near future. If that doesn't look likely to be in place by the middle of 2020, then the UK could ask for the status quo transitional period to be extended for another year or two, like I already mentioned. But in any event, the backstop may well kick in if and when the transitional period expires and there's no satisfactory alternative solution, or at least one that's ready to be put into operation. Now, designing this backstop has been absolutely tortuous. I'm sure any of you who followed the news coverage of this appreciate that already. Myself, I've said many times, to the point where I bore myself rigid as well, is that an inherently difficult conundrum was made significantly worse by the fact that the UK government insisted on promising completely irreconcilable things to different groups of people and hoping that one day it wouldn't be found out. The fools. Something had to give. Someone had to be disappointed, and yet what amazes me about this final backstop is that almost everybody has ended up disappointed. Instead of just picking one group of people and saying, throw them to the dogs, we'll live without them, she's managed Gibraltar? They're not really in the backstop. I know what my preference would have been, but I'll tell you that in a minute, or you could probably guess. Almost everybody hits this backstop. Now, as we know, the centrepiece of the backstop is basically a customs union between the whole of the UK and the EU. And the purpose of this customs union is to ensure that there will be no tariffs on trading goods between the UK and the EU, and that solves half of the Irish border problem. Because if you don't need tariffs between the UK and the EU as a whole, you don't have tariffs between Northern Ireland and the Republic, so you don't need to have customs checks for tariff purposes. So half of the problem is solved. The problem is that this customs union is built entirely on the EU's terms. The UK has to comply with the EU's external tariff system for trade with third countries. It has to comply with most of the EU's trade regime under the Common Commercial Policy for trade with third countries. The UK has to respect a whole ream of minimum standards in all sorts of fields, competition, state aid, the environment, labour and so on, so as to guarantee that UK businesses operate on a level playing field with EU businesses. And the UK will have no say in any of these things. It just has to do it whether it likes it or not. Just as importantly, this is a customs union with no identifiable expiry date. The two parties may hope that they will replace this backstop in due course with a better alternative, but there is no guarantee that that will happen in any appreciable timescale, or indeed any guarantee that it will happen at all. Theresa May likes to talk about how she's secured an explicit mechanism for reviewing the backstop, and she has. The UK can ask the EU to review the backstop, and if the EU says we're staying with it, the UK can't do anything about it. The review mechanism is basically there to try and make it look less painful. Now, on the one hand, of course, the Brexit Brigade fume about this backstop proposal. They don't want any form of customs union with the EU anyway, let alone one which, quite rightly, they see as a simple perpetuation of the vassalage condition of the transitional period itself. In their mind, it significantly limits the UK's room to race around the world doing trade deals with Donald Trump and all the rest of it. I think that's a good thing myself. But, you know, in their world, this is a catastrophe. And of course, it prevents them from pursuing their hard right dreams of getting out of the EU and immediately deregulating everything they can get their nasty little hands on. On the other hand, it's obvious that Remain supporters are also deeply unhappy about these proposals. They fall far short of full membership not only of a customs union but also the single market. And of course, it simply seems insane that we trade in our current position of leadership and influence with full votes in the institutions and full representation across the EU in return for being mere rule takers who simply do as we're told by a group of other countries. Because that's exactly what this deal does. It simply swaps us from being leaders in Europe to being rule takers in Europe. However, the customs plan isn't the only element of the proposed backstop. Because, as I said, dealing with customs duties only solves half of the problem. The other half of the problem is regulatory standards between Northern Ireland and the Republic. How do we make sure that we don't need to check goods, not just to make them pay the right money, but to make sure they're safe, to make sure that they don't contain dangerous chemicals, to make sure that they're not a threat to the public safety, that they're not illegal, blah-de-blah-de-blah. Now here, this half of the Irish border problem is basically solved by saying that Northern Ireland will remain within those bits of the single market, even though the rest of the UK won't. And that means either introducing or significantly increasing checks on goods going from Britain to Northern Ireland. Great Britain, I should say, to Northern Ireland. The treaty does try and have provisions that will minimise the visibility of those checks, the administrative burden of them, but ultimately introduction or significant expansion of checks on goods travelling from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. Now, inevitably, this has attracted the fury of the DUP. It has to be said, it's not difficult to attract the fury of the DUP. They're very easily infuriated people. But anyway, they are ideologically fixated on the idea that Northern Ireland cannot be treated any differently from the rest of the UK, despite the fact that Northern Ireland is already treated completely differently from the rest of the UK for all manner of purposes, both regulatory and fiscal, and despite the fact, and this is the thing that really gets me, that businesses in Northern Ireland have actually just been offered the best trading deal in the world. They have full access to the UK market and they have full access to the EU market interchangeably. If I were a Northern Irish business, I would be dancing with joy at this deal. Not everyone's disappointed, huh? But to make matters even more complicated, of course, Northern Ireland has been offered very special treatment, but not Scotland, not Wales, not the north of England, not Cornwall, not other regions of England, which are in an entirely comparable position to Northern Ireland or Scotland or Wales in terms of their economic underdevelopment and problems of poverty. To make matters therefore more complicated, Scotland has basically said, well, why have you given Northern Ireland unilateral access to the rest of the UK market? They can sell whatever they want to with no restrictions and no burdens, but we can't do the same with them. And we can't do the same in England, and we can't do the same in Wales. We are putting us, the Scots, or the Welsh, or the north of England, or for that matter, Stratford, at a competitive disadvantage within our own internal market. The UK government loves to rabbit on about how we're leaving the EU internal market and creating our own UK internal market. Well, it turns out that one of the founding principles of this UK internal market is to enshrine significant competitive advantages for some regions and no competitive advantages for others. That's not the basis on which most internal markets evolve. So if the backstop proposals have proven explosive, it is not entirely without justification. That's it. There we have the proposed withdrawal treaty. There's a lot of boring technical stuff, but there are three major issues: citizens' rights, the transition, and the backstop, which are all fundamentally important and, each in their own way, very controversial. Let's then say a few words about the political declaration on the principles that will govern subsequent negotiations towards a potential future relationship between the EU and the UK. Now, the text that we currently have is largely in line with the guidelines that were set out by the European Council back in March 2018. We want an ambitious and wide-ranging partnership. In some fields, that partnership will be based on international law and international standards, not much different from anyone else in the world. In other fields, it will be based on existing EU rules or existing EU models for how to engage with third countries, so not that much different from Canada or Korea or wherever. And in other respects, we'll try and go beyond those familiar experiences or models and aim for a deeper level of cooperation, particularly in the field of cross-border criminal cooperation. Now, if we define a hard Brexit at anything which falls short of full single market and customs union membership, then of course this is the blueprint for a very hard Brexit indeed. And it doesn't matter how you dress it up, it doesn't matter how you try and use nice language like ambitious partnership, this is a hard Brexit. But of course that outcome was sealed as soon as Theresa May announced her red lines without any real public debate or parliamentary consensus. Otherwise, however, if we just take the political declaration on its own terms, it's very sketchy. There's very little detail, it doesn't tell you very much, most of it is entirely aspirational language. We will try to cooperate in the field of culture, we'll try to cooperate in the field of financial services, we'll cooperate on the environment. This, frankly, is a political declaration that almost could have been signed between the EU and North Korea, let alone South Korea. Most countries in the world want to cooperate. Most countries do not go out of their way to cause trouble for other ones. Not all, I know not all. But like I said before, this 26-page political declaration of aspirations and ideas has to be translated into a 3,000 or 4,000-page legally binding treaty. And remember that this legally binding treaty, this time, doesn't just have to be ratified by the UK Parliament and the European Parliament and the 27 governments in the Council. It will have to be ratified by every single national parliament in the whole of Europe, which includes all of the little Belgian regional parliaments that the Brexiteers love to sneer at, and also, of course, doesn't stop any country that feels like it holding a national referendum on whether they'd like to ratify this new relationship with the UK. So, are there any guarantees, either of a timescale or of content or of anything at all? Of course not. But for now, let's just highlight a couple of interesting points about the political declaration. And I've actually got pages and pages of notes here, and I realise that I've probably been talking quite a bit already. So I'll cut through some of them and basically just say, and this will deal with about 2 pages, the Chequers plan, dead. Bye-bye. It's gone completely. We don't need to think about it anymore. There will be border checks and customs controls between the UK and the EU into the future. Now, from another perspective, this clear indication that the Chequers plan is dead, there will be no frictionless trade between the EU and the UK. There will be border checks, there will be controls. This is actually really quite confusing when you relate it back to everything else that we've just talked about in terms of the backstop. Because the EU and the UK said that they want to find a better relationship to replace the backstop in the future. Now, the backstop gets rid of all border checks and controls. It has to. That's why it's a backstop, to avoid a border in Ireland. How can you find a better alternative to the backstop which involves checks and controls? That just doesn't make sense. Unless, of course, there are two other potential explanations. The first possibility is that as soon as the next general election is over and Theresa May no longer needs the DUP, she'll cut Northern Ireland adrift and just say, off you go to be regulated by the EU in customs and regulatory terms. It's not our problem anymore. So that's a perfectly possible explanation for how you square the backstop promises with this political declaration. The other possibility is that maybe Theresa May actually envisages a much closer relationship with the EU than she's prepared to admit before Brexit actually happens. Now, again, that's a perfectly plausible explanation. It would make sense of the political declaration in the context of the backstop promises. The point here is that we don't know, and we can't know, because this is just an example of how utterly vague and completely meaningless most of this political declaration actually is. It can mean anything to anybody who wants to project onto it their own wants and desires, their own fears or aspirations. We actually know very little about the future relationship between the UK and the EU, and it was never going to be otherwise. Okay, it's time for me to wrap up with some conclusions so that we can move on to questions. What should we make of this proposed withdrawal package, this whole full blue folder worth of stuff? Ooh, is that me? No, I think it was just going like that. Hold on. Hold on a sec. Sorry about this. I was thinking maybe an alien was going to jump around. It certainly looks like it, doesn't it? We need to avoid simplistic binary assessments. Every time you turn on the news, you're going to be told, it's a good deal. No, it's a bad deal. It's a good deal. It's a bad deal. We can't be as simple as that. Equally, we need to be very careful about Theresa May's argument. Although she doesn't put it this way, I'll rephrase it for her. The Brexit is such a bloody horror show that anything which isn't a complete catastrophe is somehow presented as a triumph or a success. So we need to be careful either about binary assessments or about falling for this idea that something which is actually not that great is somehow fantastic. Instead, we need to acknowledge that this deal is a product of two main combinations of factors: political choices and inescapable realities. The political choices we can rhyme off, and most people in this room will know them already. David Cameron decided to hold a referendum in a country which has no particular experience of referenda and made no preparations whatsoever for the potential consequences of what might happen as a result of his referendum. That's a political choice. The May government decided, without any particular debate or consultation, to adopt, endorse and pursue some of the very worst fantasies of the Leave campaign that were expressed during that referendum. That was another political choice. The 2017 general election was another pivotal political choice, not least because it left the UK government entirely dependent on the DUP and offered, frankly, a bunch of medievalist bigots entire control over the very future of this whole country, including the negotiations which were ongoing with the EU. Now, those were all political choices. Theresa May could have made different ones, David Cameron could have made different ones, but this deal is partly the result of the political choices, the pretty bad political choices that the UK governments have made. But this deal is also the product of certain stark and inescapable realities. We are in the process of finding out what it means to be a medium-sized country engaging in negotiations with a global power bloc. That is our experience at the moment. We are discovering the real world of what it means to engage as a medium-sized country in international negotiations with a global power bloc. let alone in a situation where the inherently smaller country is utterly, hopelessly divided and cannot negotiate its way out of a paper bag, while, perhaps surprisingly, the global power bloc has managed to maintain a show of unity which has taken nearly all of us, even those of us who work in the field, by genuine surprise. To say nothing of a situation, of course, where the UK is completely desperate to avoid a no deal because we know that we cannot deal with the consequences without inflicting terrible damage upon our own society. Now, against that background, this draft deal has its merits. Of course it does. It will avoid the short-term chaos of a no-deal Brexit. It will prevent the return of a hard border in Northern Ireland and therefore increase the chances of the peace process not collapsing back into a state of intermittent civil war. But those benefits, and they are few if significant, come at a very significant cost. The vassal state of the transitional period, the vassal state continued of the backstop, further mistrust and anger between Scotland, London and Cardiff, to say nothing, of course, of the terrible spectacle of watching our own political system demonstrate to the world just how incompetent and ill-fit to govern it actually is. But just as importantly, nothing in the UK government's deal will actually change any of the underlying fundamentals of the UK situation at this time. First of all, we've already said it, we have no idea, no clarity, no guarantees about what the longer-term relationship of this country to the European Union actually is. This is a blindfold Brexit. And don't forget, it's only until very recently that Teresa May and David Davies and a whole range of other ministers were telling us that this entire future agreement would have been signed and settled months ago already. This is what they genuinely believed. Secondly, it's obvious, Brexit remains an act of profound, long-term national diminishment. We are squandering our leadership within one of the most important international organisations on earth, and through it, we are squandering a substantial part of our influence in global affairs. Does that do us any good? No. Does it do the world any good? No. Let's be clear about what I said before. The world doesn't belong to medium-sized countries. Whether we like it or not, international relations, international law, international partnerships are determined by global and regional power blocs. The problem for Brexit is the EU was our global and regional power bloc. It was our power bloc. And within it and through it, we promoted, we defended our interests and the interests of our closest friends and allies in the rest of the world. Anybody who believes that the UK can replicate, let alone increase or improve, that level of influence acting on its own is not only ignorant but deeply dangerous. And yet that's exactly what the government is claiming. Thirdly, Brexit remains one of the largest and most far-reaching decisions by any population in modern history to disenfranchise itself from a vast range of freedoms and opportunities, of safeguards and protections, not least against its own government. For millions of people, now and into the future, our life choices and our horizons are about to be radically diminished. Many of the freedoms and opportunities that I've taken for granted throughout my entire life are no longer going to be available to you, or your children, or your grandchildren. Now, it's easy to focus here on the obvious things, the chance to study or work in another European country. Isn't it lovely? Free emergency healthcare when we're on holiday in France or Spain. That's not really what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is the concrete guarantee of minimum standards of protection for workers, for the environment, for consumers, for public health, for virtually everything that I actually value in a civilized society, because all of those things are going to disappear and there will be no protections left to any government that can command a majority in the House of Commons. One of the great ironies of this backstop would be if actually the EU ends up as the prime guarantor of our social and welfare rights in this country against our own government. Fourthly, the draft deal does nothing to repair our damaged democracy or rebuild our fractured social cohesion. I'm not going to mince my words here. The referendum and its aftermath have simply made a mockery of the UK as a mature and responsible democracy. And it's not all just the lies, the constant lies of the Leave campaign. I've now come to the conclusion that they actually believe a lot of this shite for themselves. I didn't always think that, but now, having met some of them and you watch the goggle eyes swiveling in the head, I think they do actually believe a lot of it. It's not just certainly the breaches of data protection rules during the campaign, probably also, although it's still under investigation, electoral funding rules, and so on and so forth. It's simply the fact that democracies shouldn't be governed by systematic dishonesty and shouldn't reward and encourage blatant liars through high office. That's not how healthy democracy works. Fifthly, Brexit, of course, remains a vast distraction, an enormous waste of time and energy and resources and money. All of this being poured not into improving this country or the lives of its citizens, just into trying to prevent the damage which Brexit is going to bring. We're replacing regulatory regimes that we already had. We're replicating institutions that we were already members of and that work perfectly fine. We're trying to find solutions to problems that we've already solved. And in the meantime, addressing inequality, don't have time for that. Alleviating poverty, far too busy for that. Promoting fair and equal opportunities, we've got other priorities. We're too busy trying to plug the gaps in the NHS caused by the collapse in recruitment of EU doctors and nurses. Far too busy to actually deal with the problems which this country genuinely faces. And last, but of course very far from least, Brexit remains the proud achievement and chief inspiration for the forces of illiberal authoritarianism which are currently on the march right across the Western world. Some of you will have heard me say this before. I probably said it in Stratford the last time I was here, but we can never say it often enough. For many of the leading Leave campaigners and their international supporters, leaving the EU is not an end in itself. Leaving the EU is simply an opportunity to further their hard-right dreams of some political, economic, cultural, social revolution in this country. They openly speak about leaving the EU as a once-in-a-generation chance to transform the UK. Brexit, though, hasn't just fueled support for anti-rational, socially divisive, politically aggressive, largely right-wing movements in this country, but elsewhere too. Right across the world, Brexit is an inspiration for every nationalist, populist, charlatan and demagogue. See what happens when you tell the biggest whoppers that you can possibly find. See what happens when you play on people's fears, when you whip up their resentment, when you exploit their genuine grievances. You can win too. And that is the overwhelming lesson of Brexit to the rest of the world. Lie big and you can win. So whatever its limited merits, in the grand scheme of things, I'm afraid this deal doesn't change any of those underlying fundamentals. Where does all of that lead us? Now, in a way, the reaction of the hardcore leavers has, of course, been entirely predictable. This race has nothing to do with them. They have no responsibility for it whatsoever. Remember, not long ago, the UK held all the cards. The weak and desperate EU was going to be eating out of our hand. We were going to be the easiest deal in human history. Now that reality has shown them to be the pathological liars that they are, how have they reacted? Have they grovelled on their knees and said, sorry, we got it wrong? Of course not. They've replaced the old lies with new lies. The bullies in Brussels are punishing poor little Britain. The treacherous Remainers in Whitehall and in the government, even Teresa May, one of previously their darling, is simply a treacherous hag. Honestly, if you read some of the misogynistic comments that you'll find on some of the main websites, it would scare you. But this is just another dangerous version of the stabbed in the back myth, which has been the common currency of every nationalist populist throughout history. For their part, of course, the less extreme Brexiteers fantasise about going back to the negotiating table, about getting a better deal and persuading the EU to do it again. The fact is that most of whatever the alternative choices and alternative possibilities were, that there's no time for them anymore. And the EU has pretty much made clear that we're prepared to reopen the Article 50 process only for one eventuality, that you're going to remain. And you're going to have a serious national debate about it. But short of that, you had your chance and you blew it. This is the deal. So at least Theresa May, after 2.5 years, got one thing right. The real choice facing us is no deal, catastrophe. This deal, well, it has some merits, but it doesn't change any of the underlying fundamentals which will diminish this country and its population for a very long time to come, or no Brexit. I think I've probably spoken for long enough, so I'll finish there, and I'll look forward to your questions.
It's time for questions. Now I'm going to be pretty hard on questions. We don't want, I remember back in 19 stuff, and we don't want statements. I want short questions that generally begin with how, who, what, when. We want as many questions as we can. Gentlemen, in hand up there.
Are you speculating how the next few months might play out, particularly regarding
Sorry. Yep.
So the question was, are you really speculating how the next few months might play out, particularly with regards to climate change?
Okay. It's obviously a short question with an enormous potential answer, but of course it's the question that we're all thinking about. I'll just run through some of the parameters. We can't be quite sure what's going to happen. Nobody can really be quite sure. We might all get hit by a meteorite tomorrow and put us all out of our misery. But Section 13 of the European Union Withdrawal Act says that three things basically have to be done in order for this bill to proceed this deal to proceed on the UK side. It needs to be approved in Parliament, and that's happening on the 11th of December. If that approval is granted, the government will then bring forward a new piece of primary legislation to implement the deal in the UK law, and that will have to work its way through the parliamentary process. And they have to go through the pretty much less complicated, but still not a straightforward process for formal ratification of the treaty, which allows the House of Commons an indefinite power of delay. So approval of the deal, implementation bill, and ratification. Now, at the minute, the biggest hurdle looks like it's going to be approval. We know that the government just wants to take it or leave it vote. We know there's been lots of machinations about whether the Commons will actually see the party amend the government's motion and so on and so forth. In a way, we're in a funny situation where it's looking like even if the government has its take it or leave it vote, it's doomed to failure. I'm sure many of the people in the room saw some of the newspaper calculations which suggested that there could be 100 MP gap between voting against and voting for. So even if quite a few Tories fall back into line between now and the 11th of December, it's not looking good. If she loses by a small margin, I suppose the political commentators are speculating that she'll try again. If she loses by a large margin, I suppose they're speculating that she'll be gone within hours. And then we will be faced with the choice that I mentioned before. Does someone else try and get this deal through as the markets respond? Do we end up on a course for no deal, which it would be just beyond comprehension, I think. Or do they basically say, we'll try and ask the people and just see what they say? But that's
Good question.
The nice thing is that a couple of weeks ago, I would have had to say, oh, well, there's this argument, this argument, this argument, this argument. The good thing is the European Court of Justice hearing was today on the Scottish reference that will give us a clear answer to this, potentially. But there's a big hurdle with that case, because you probably heard about the Dutch challenge that was rejected this week. You know that a group of UK citizens living in the EU27 had brought a legal action in the Dutch courts challenging the withdrawal negotiations as being an infringement of their democratic rights because they were deprived the right to vote in the referendum. It was always doomed to fail. This was a very good example of a case that was about political profile rather than actual concrete legal chances of success. But the grounds on which it was rejected is basically procedural grounds. They were told that this measure isn't directed towards you, it doesn't affect your legal interest, you've challenged the wrong decision, basically. And so all of that money, all of that time, totally wasted. If they'd asked me or any other competent EU lawyer, we would have said, why are you challenging that measure? It's the wrong one. You need to challenge this measure. They just got it procedurally wrong. One of the big risks with this Article 50 case is that the UK government's only real argument in the case is this is a hypothetical question because we're not trying to revoke Article 50. And the Court of Justice is not allowed to answer hypothetical questions. And that's a basic principle of its jurisdiction. The court deals with genuine disputes, referred to it by national courts, which need its interpretation in order to settle the dispute between individuals. The UK government's argument is this is purely hypothetical. So you can't even answer the question. You just have to dismiss the case, just like they did with the Dutch case a few days before. So in a way, what we're all waiting for is for the court to say, well, it might be a bit hypothetical, and it might be, but we'll basically trust that the national court has made this reference in a genuine way, and we'll answer the question. We just do it.
One may argue that the reason is not exactly because the new next spring. Do you think all those tax laws by those big fund managers that are actually trying to avoid it? I don't understand whether that will actually abide by this.
Okay, so the position under this deal is that anything which happens in EU law before the end of the transitional period, which provisionally is the end of December 2020, but could be the end of December 2021 or the end of December 2022, anything which happens in EU law, legislation, executive acts, case law, is binding on the UK in full. Yeah. There are a few exceptions. For example, the UK will not be entitled to opt in to completely new EU initiatives in the fight against cross-border crime. What a victory for taking back control. But, there are a few exceptions, but by and large, pretty much everything that happens within the EU between the 29th of March 2019 and the end of transition is fully binding on the UK. What then happens after the end of transition? Well, if we assume nothing else, that there isn't any form of agreement between the UK and the EU, on a purely domestic level, the European Union Withdrawal Act converts the whole of EU law into purely domestic law. Yeah? So basically just takes all of it and says this is no longer EU rules, this is now UK rules. And they will remain on the statute book unless and until Parliament or a minister gets rid of them in due course. So whatever we inherit during the transitional period will at least initially then be carried through into UK domestic law into the future. The last little qualification is that in the backstop, and inevitably in any future arrangements, the EU is basically saying level playing field isn't just about competition and state aid and the environment and workers. Level playing field is about tax avoidance, good tax practices, and everything that goes with it. So anyone who hopes that leaving the EU will also lead to the opportunities for massive tax evasion or avoidance might well find themselves deeply disappointed by the long-term consequences of what they've bargained for. Compared to just staying in and it being like that anyway.
Okay, here's the mic now.
Thank you. Do you think a case can be made against some of our wonderful scumbag politicians for the lies that they, and the deceit and the treason they keep in the country?
I can absolutely understand the sentiment. I can, of course I can. The problem is that our democracy, remember, is not a very robust one in some respects. And maybe I can give a specific answer to your question, but then widen it out a little bit as well. If it had been possible to prosecute these people, they would have been done already, because there are about 16 million of us who've been trying to support it. The fact is that our democracy is not enormously robust about these things, and it is perfectly possible for politicians to stand up and lie through their teeth, almost with impunity. Not in every context, of course, but almost with impunity. Now, we should bear in mind, of course, that there are certain proceedings which are ongoing, the investigation into the Iron Banks part of the Leave campaign and where the money came from. There are still investigations ongoing. But in a way, I think your question is important from a broader perspective. And this is one of the issues which I think we're also fixed on the current issues around the negotiation and withdrawal and second referendum and so on, that we're not necessarily paying full attention to the longer term perspective of what happens if we do leave the EU and what comes next. This is about, and maybe links up with your question as well, this is about a fundamental change in the relationship between citizen and state in this country. We've all grown up for 45 years with the idea that the power of the state has been mediated and tempered through EU membership. The member states are told that there are certain things they just cannot do because it's incompatible with being a member of the EU. We agree common standards in all sorts of fields. We cooperate in ways which share good practice, and all of those are going to disappear. And it's going to be left, us, with an electoral system where you can get 33% of the vote, but get a majority in the Commons, and then you have absolute power in this country. Very few people in this room will even remember when that was constitutionally the case in this country, and the world has changed enormously. The powers of the state, the capacity for surveillance, life has changed enormously. And yet we're going back to a constitutional settlement which looks more like something out of the 14th century than the 21st century. So I think your question is very important, but it's very important because this is a flavour of what is to come. This is about a fundamental change in the relationship between citizen and state in this country.
Just with the hand up, just
I've heard nothing in discussions about this broadly on any ongoing financial obligations which the UK still may have towards the EU. So, is that because that hasn't been agreed, or is the government just not talking about it?
Okay. I sort of mentioned it at the very start, but said it was so boring that it wasn't worth thinking about. What they've agreed, I'll go into a little bit more detail now. So what they've agreed is that they've agreed a set of principles to govern the financial settlement. And the principles are fairly straightforward. The UK has to honour any commitments which it made as a member state before the 2016 referendum. Nobody should be worse off because of the UK's decision to leave than they would have been otherwise. Principles like that. And what they've done in the text over this very tedious part 5 of the treaty is set out the methodology by which they'll calculate the precise financial settlement as time goes on. But by its very nature, and I am not an accountant, and in fact I find numbers inherently boring, but apparently by its very nature, because of the way that the EU budget works, with money coming in and out, and some commitments will last for many years of time, and so you can't quite fully calculate the liabilities until that time is expired, or at least gone further down the line. What they've agreed is a methodology for calculating the financial settlement. But the actual calculations will be running on for years to come. And that's why what we hear are estimates from the Office for National Statistics, or the Budgetary Responsibility, whatever it is. They produce estimates of what they think the UK's financial liabilities will be according to that methodology, using whatever we know right now about expenditure and liabilities and so on. But the precise final figure will unveil itself over time. The other complicating factor is, of course, that if the transition period is extended, then there will be a new financial settlement, and if it's extended, for 2 years, it'll be an even bigger financial settlement. They still haven't actually figured out, and there's no rules in the backstop protocol, who actually pays for this customs union, who's actually going to bear the costs of this new arrangement, because it's going to cost money. They haven't actually figured out the rules on who's going to do that. That will have to be calculated in due course. So the answer is, there's a methodology, but there's not a figure, and there probably couldn't be a figure.
I'm interested in tactics and strategy. Am I right that really time is on us? I come from Birmingham because you get some really good speakers such as Professor Dougan, but it's all urgent. I've been out in Bromsgrove collecting petitions to Sajid Javid, just as a sort of test because he's near Birmingham. But I had in mind of going to Rees Mogg's constituency, Liam Fox's constituency, all over the country, key MPs. But I'm not quite sure if that's still the right thing to do.
Can you tell me what your question is?
So what if we want to go into overdrive to save the day and stay in the European Union? What else should we be doing apart from seeking to understand things? Professor Dougan might have, but also I'd love to have any guidance from anybody afterwards.
I think this is probably a question which can be better answered by some of the fantastic campaigners in Stratford. I'll just point you in the direction of one thing, which I think is a really good resource. Best for Britain has a campaign guide for citizens and groups about how to actually use your time and your effort and your energy productively to influence political actors. It's available on their website. If you go to Best for Britain and just click on their links and resources, they do have this guide, this campaign guide for citizens about how to, what not to waste your time on and what is actually much more effective. And I sat through a presentation on it. I thought it was really convincing. I've read it and I thought it was really good. Obviously, the 11th of December is crucial, in the sense that if Parliament approves this deal on the 11th of December, it will be a meteorite that saves us from bloody Brexit. But I think we need to also keep a broader perspective here. Even if the charlatans and demagogues succeed in dragging us out of the EU next March, even if they succeed in that, as far as I'm concerned, that's just the trigger to campaign to get back in again. That's it. It's just a campaign. But in the meantime, just one last point. In the meantime, I think we've also got to be conscious that this, like I said before, this is no longer just a battle about staying in the EU or getting back into the EU. This is a much bigger problem now. This is basically about people who believe in liberal democracy and a social market versus people who don't. And it's actually quite a frightening situation to find not just our country, but our continent and indeed our hemisphere in, where there are genuine large numbers of people at the head of successful political movements taking power who simply do not believe in a liberal social market democracy. So this is about much more than EU membership. Huh?
Okay. We've got time for one question. Is there a lady here who has a question? Lady here. Remember, Michael will be staying so you can ask them questions in groups later.
I know this goes back from the beginning, but was there a different way to trigger Article 50 in law which would have given us a different and better result, forgetting the red lines?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there could have been a very, very different way for Theresa May to have handled this entire situation. Theresa May could have taken office as Prime Minister and gone away with to think about it for a couple of days with some high-level advisors and come back and said, we had a referendum which has been deeply divisive. The country was almost evenly split. And there is substantial evidence that people were promised things that they cannot be delivered. So we really need to think about what we're going to do and think about it carefully and see how to manage this. And that process of consultation and deliberation could have led to an EEA application rather than what we've got at the moment, or it could have led to we need to have a proper, thorough deliberation about what our options are in the future, and then we'll come back and ask you which one you prefer. She could have dealt with this very differently. Instead, she basically thought, I'm going to throw my lot in with a bunch of red lines and a lot of hypocrites and liars and just side with them. And at the same time, I'm going to promise everybody else that they're still going to get everything that they wanted as well.
Michael, I think that's the end of the initial. Michael, thank you very much.
Right, can I, just before we do finish the formal part of the evening, can I just have your attention just for a couple more minutes, and I will thank Michael again at the end. I just wanted to give some reminders, if I could. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question tonight, not all is not lost, because you have another opportunity on Thursday the 13th of December, which will be after the vote in Parliament, so that should be very interesting. Michael is coming this way again, not to Stratford but to Banbury. It's going to be in the Town Hall on the 13th of December at 7 o'clock. Jay is over there, who's from the Banbury group, so if you want to ask him about that, he's over there. But that should be very an interesting talk, as I say, after the vote in Parliament. Also, for Stratford for Europe, we have our open meeting coming up next week on the 6th of December at 7 o'clock. That'll be at Stratford College. And we have a keynote address being given by Edward Macmillan Scott, who's chairing the campaign groups who are campaigning for a people's vote. And that's going to be at Stratford District College. Places are limited because of the venue, so I do advise if you'd like to come along to that, you do need to book on Eventbrite to make sure you can get a seat. Now, very importantly for us, we have something else critical coming up, because Stratford for Europe has been organised a petition to Stratford District Council, and the agreement is that if we can get 1,000 signatures in both our online petition and our written petition, then we will be able to take our petition to a full meeting of Stratford District Council on the 17th of December. Our petition is to ask them, or to urge them, to support a people's vote. So if you manage to get into the hall tonight and manage to get away with not signing it, could you please not manage to not sign it on the way out? Make sure you do sign it, please, because we're just short of about 60 signatures and we've only got till Friday to do it. I have to say, nobody else has ever done a petition to the council like this, so this is a first. It's a first for them and a first for us. Finally, just two more quick ones. We're also, as you can imagine, at the moment, we talked about what we need to do campaigning-wise. In Stratford Europe, we're writing to not only our own MP, Nadine Zahawi, we're flooding him with letters, urging him to get behind a people's vote, but also to other MPs. And what we're looking for is volunteers to help us write some letters. And if you would be willing to write one or more letters, I'd be grateful if you could give your name and your email address to George, who's standing in the door there, at the table outside where all the signing in was, and then he can send you some copies of letters and addresses and the MPs that we need you to write to. And very, very lastly on that note, if you're not a signed up supporter to Stratford for Europe, I do urge you please to become one, and then you'll get all our free emails with our future events, our street stalls and all the other campaigning activities. You can find us, all details of our membership, on our website, as well as on Facebook and Twitter. And I said finally, but that was a bit of a con. I feel a bit like a Leaver politician. There is one very, very final thing, and that is a plea, and I hate this bit, and it's always the hard part. But everyone here, as you appreciate, all the volunteers outside, even Michael, give up their time, completely voluntary and free. But we do have expenses. We do have to print leaflets. We do have to hire this hall, magnificent it is, but it costs us about £100. And we don't have any rich backers, we don't have any rich sponsors. We rely entirely on your generosity and the generosity of my steering team. So if you would be willing to give us a small donation on your way out, we'd be exceptionally grateful, and thank you very much. And I know you've probably all donated in the past, but thank you very much. So I just want to finish then by, again, thanking Michael, and can we just give a big round of applause. Thank you very much. I thought that was going to be my P45, but it's actually a couple of letters to Nadeem Zahawi. So anyway, so thank you all for coming tonight. Do stop behind, have a drink, and do come and have a chat with Michael if you'd like to. Thank you very much.